Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Crazy Froggy. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Froggy, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. É o Grace Frog, aí. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Crazy Frog, Grace 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 Frog. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, oh Grace Frog, 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 Crazy Frog, Grace Frog, Axel Foley, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, I like to move it, Grace Frog, 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 I like to move it, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Oh, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Oh yeah, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, that DJ. Grace Frog DJ. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog shots. Hustle for that muscle. Workout, Grace Frog. Workout, Grace Frog. Workout, workout, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, a ring, jing, 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 jing. Grace Frog, a Grace Frog, a ring, jing, 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 jing. A Grace Frog, a ring, jing, 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 jing. A Grace Frog, a ring, jing, 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 jing. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Oh, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, the Flash. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. I ring, jing, 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 jing. Oh, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, we are the champions, Grace Frog. We are the champion, Grace Frog. Official video. Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, popcorn. Grace Frog, popcorn. Grace Frog, Axel Foley. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Grace, Frog, Frog. Grace Frog, hand up, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, I ring ding 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 ding. I Grace Frog, I ring ding 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 ding. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. I ring ding 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 ding. Oh, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. For the muscle, workout, Grace Frog, workout. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. I ring ding 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 ding. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. I ring ding 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 ding. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. I ring ding 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 ding. Grace Frog, Axel Foley. Grace Frog. We are the champions, Grace Frog. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. We are the champions, Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. The Flash. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. Axel Road. Grace Frog, Grace Frog, Grace Frog. I ring ding 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 ding.